tax rate equal to the probability that the government is the efficient owner of that land at some point in the future, then it turns out you have an incentive to say exactly what your value is.
Is this method used anywhere? Like, it seems very efficient.
It was actually used in like 14th century Spain to collect property taxes, and I think it's used in a few places in the world right now. I think the problem is that the probability, usually the government wants to raise more taxes through property taxes than the probability that they end up being the efficient owner of the land. And the probability that they end up being the efficient owner of the land is sufficiently small that people don't even have an incentive to respond to this sort of thing. So, and if you make it higher than the probability, then they underreport, even though they know that the government might buy it, because they think the probability the government ends up buying it, even at the low, artificially reduced price, is not that high, right? So the government has to like credibly commit to buying land quite often in order for them to charge a relatively high rate and still have it be accessible this way. But it's an interesting system nonetheless, and it illustrates a broader property which comes out of this paper by Winston and Segal, which is that if two people are bargaining with each other, if you have partial property rights to each person, like if one person wants to get it from the other, then they have to buy them out. And if the other person wants to keep it, then they have to buy the other person out, rather than having one person own it and the other person potentially be the buyer. That can actually be more efficient. And one sort of interesting application of that is that if you think about like countries, you could, and imagine that there's some disputed island. Like right now, Japan and China are fighting over this island, the Diaoyu or Senkaku Islands, depending on who you talk to. If right now Japan has like complete physical control over that island, and the question is, would that thing be easier to resolve if that were the case? Or in like Cyprus, where both Greece and Turkey have control sort of over half the island, right? And my argument would be actually often it's the case that when each side has half, it's easier to resolve it. Because when one side has all of it, it's much easier, like there's much more incentive to sort of like bluster over it. Whereas if each has half, neither is fully satisfied with the current situation. And so both sort of have, if they bluster and say like, I really want this, well then they have to sort of man up. And if they back down, then you see, so there's this like balance in the incentives that comes in the same way as in this situation. Okay. This is similar for other types of problems. So for example, debt settlements or corporate acquisitions, there's usually some right to force out people who are holdouts by a majority of people who consent. And the other way that these are sometimes subsidized is you use the coercive power of the state in general to subsidize public goods in a local area or to subsidize the acquisition of land for public use. Both of those things are usually combined in most applications. Okay. So how do we determine when, yeah, Jim?
Sorry, before you continue.
Yeah.
So why would we care just about the person's house value and not like their replacement value? Like if I live near like a railroad track or something that's being expanded, if I have to move, probably whatever I'm buying is going to cost more than my house did because it's going to be in an area further away from the railroad track.
Well, I mean, if you're, that would completely solve the problem if you were completely indifferent. But I think, so that would solve the problem. You would just give the person their replacement value for, you know, what you think is a fair replacement value. But the question is, what is an equally good alternative house for that person? Some people might say that's a mansion for them. Some people might say that it's like a shack, right? So I think you run into the same problem then a little bit too. But if there's like a completely equivalent land and you know exactly what that is and there's a liquid market for that, then the problem's solved, right? Because you can always use a mechanism which says you either keep this piece of land or we give you the alternative land. And that's exactly what the FCC spectrum thing is, actually. So the whole FCC spectrum thing was based on the argument that this other channel is equally good, and so we can just use that as an alternative, right? Okay, so how do we determine when to use the coercive state, right? We need to build, in order for these projects to get built, I've tried to argue, we're going to have the government involved in some way. But once we have the government involved, just people consenting and the efficiency of the market, decentralized can never work, right? So the question is, how do we determine whether to build the project or not? And this is very similar to the externalities discussion we were having before, right? We had to there figure out how do we get information from a diffuse public to figure out whether it's worth creating a project or not. And what did we talk about as ways of gathering that information from the public then, Mike?
We could ask how people value certain harms that are caused by other people. So you could ask how people might value the project or how it might affect their behavior and incentives for other actions.
Using sort of a survey or something like that.
Yeah, that's one way to do it, although it's not perfect.
Yeah, so what are other ways that we talked about in that lecture?
You can look at their, I guess, I can't remember exactly what we had talked about, but you can look at how they react to other changes in the market for like elasticities of demand.
Yeah, so you could do some sort of scientific or like economic model analysis where you're being like, well, this person has lived in this place for this many years. People who've lived in it for this many years typically value it this much. So let's give them that that's one sort of analysis you could do. And what's the third thing we talked about?
I don't know, it's similar to sort of like willingness to pay to avoid the harm.
Yeah, does anyone remember what the last thing we talked about was in that lecture? Vickery-Clark-Groves mechanism, or the expected externality mechanism, right? So you can have assessment by experts, as we talked about. You could have, and that's sort of like what the real estate agents do, right? They're sort of assessing the market value and then adding something, right? You could do ineffective surveys, or you could do a fancy mechanism like VCG or the expected externality mechanism. And the first is probably the most commonly used, right? The second is somewhat commonly used, but obviously pretty weird. And the third is like never used. No one ever uses any of these fancy mechanisms, right? Chrissy, do you see any like differences in this problem versus the externality problem?
So in this problem, we're basically trying to map everybody's preferences onto some sort of a decision.
Yeah.
And map all of that onto the social.
Yeah.
And with the externalities, I think we're just trying to like balance out the harms versus what was happening. Yeah, so in this case, it's I think just trying to motivate everybody to.
Yeah, I think you're onto the right thing. What's the key difference in information between those two settings?
Right. So what we're talking about now, the individuals are like they have all of the information.
Yeah, so before we thought that there might be some issue of like individuals having diffuse information, right? And that would create a problem. But here we think that like it's absolutely key that the individuals have the information. And so just relying purely on expert assessment, we think is going to get things really, really wrong, right? And so it's really a quantitative rather than a qualitative difference from the other setting, right? So in these settings, often people try to use something that's none of these things above, which is voting. So voting is a way of trying to incorporate individuals' preferences in a less manipulable way, but a way that's not necessarily efficient, right? These mechanisms we talked about were efficient, but we knew that they ran into all of these potentially really bad problems. The expected externality mechanism, we had no idea how to use it at all, right? We just don't know how to run it because it requires all this detailed information. The VCG is subject to all sorts of collusion and manipulation, especially in these binary decision problems, right? Those were the most extreme bad cases of VCG. And so voting is a way to get information from the public when it's really key to do that without having to use one of these potentially really problematic mechanisms, right? So let's think about whether voting is a good way to make these types of decisions. So let's imagine again that everyone has some shares and they have IID valuations, right? We would like the project to be created if the sum of everyone's values exceed the cost. That is, if the average value is greater than the cost divided by the number of people. But when is it going to pass under voting? Imagine we have majority vote. Jack, when will voting approve this thing?
It'll
Yeah.
the net benefit is less than the net cost.
Absolutely. And just to rephrase what you said, if the majority approves it, that's the same as saying that the median value is greater than the cost over n, whereas we want it to be determined by whether the mean value is greater than the cost over n, right? So voting is going to be efficient only when the mean is equal to the median, which is roughly that that one side doesn't have a more intense set of preferences than the other does. Jack gave an example where one side had a very intense preference not to get it passed. You could imagine the opposite, which is that there could be a majority of people who just slightly prefer not to have it, and then some people who have essentially no value on their land and would, or have a huge value for the project, right? Okay, so a sufficient condition for this is a symmetric distribution of valuations, and in a finite population, this is not quite enough because it's the empirical mean versus the empirical median, but it sort of gives you the basic idea. Now, Ted Bergstrom had a really nice argument about how this should affect how we tax people. And Dan, do you remember what that was?
Trying to remember. It's because basically that you want to do it when the mean is, but it's based on the median. So if you can suggest how much people pay based on how much they're taxed, and you can use differences in wealth, which are asymmetric, to get a more approximation. So people are symmetric for a given income.
Yeah, exactly. So I mean, imagine that people have a valuation that's symmetrically distributed, but that's multiplied by their income in terms of how much they're willing to pay for the good. And income is distributed log normally, which is not symmetric at all, right? It's very right skewed. Well, then if you tax people based on their income, and you say you have to pay a certain fraction of your income, well, then you're always going to get the efficient thing under majority rule, because if the value is symmetrically distributed, conditional on the income, you're in good shape, right? And so Bergstrom argued that not only just basing things on income, we should base things on whatever it takes in order to make whatever conditional thing is symmetric, because then majority rule will work well, right? So I think that's a pretty interesting principle of public finance, or you want to organize taxation in such a way that you sort of have a better sense for the remaining uncertainty. And once you do, you can then set the threshold in the right way so that it gets things right. Yeah, Carl.
So there doesn't really seem to be anything special about the median as a quantile. You could require a supermajority and then think about whatever that means for
this slide.
Yeah. So okay.
Yeah.
Does it seem like the use of supermajorities is accords with where we think situations in which okay, you're going there.
Yeah. So
go for it.
So if rather than majority rule we used a supermajority, the good would be created if at least X% of the population supports it, right? Which could be a supermajority, or it could be a less than supermajority, right? Or less than full majority. So, which would be a supermajority to reject the thing, right? And so then this would be efficient in large populations as long as the mean is equal to the X quantile of the distribution. So you could think that there might be some cases where we know what the value of X is. And Carl, why don't you go on with what you were saying? Because I was going to ask Jim about that, but that's fine. I'll ask you about it. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
I was just going to say...
So let's think about some of the cases where we use super